In this lesson, we'll cover the advanced configuration of Envy's nonlinear stretch feature. We covered the basics of nonlinear stretch in a previous lesson, which should suffice for most users. If you haven't watched that lesson yet, please do so before continuing, as this lesson assumes you're familiar with that earlier material. However, in this lesson, we'll explore more advanced nonlinear stretch concepts and controls, showing how to customize the look of NLS to suit your preferences. For this lesson, I'll walk you through the nonlinear stretch setup guide available on madVRenvy.com. Then we'll go hop on an Envy and demonstrate the concepts learned. Let's go ahead and get started. So let's start with a brief recap of nonlinear stretch and what it is. Nonlinear stretch is typically used to fill a screen so there's no black bars when watching content with an aspect ratio that's different than the screen's aspect ratio. For instance, you can use nonlinear stretch to remove the side black bars when watching 16:9 content on a 240 screen, or remove or reduce the top and bottom black bars when watching 240 content on a 16:9 screen. The Envy contains a nonlinear stretch profile group with Smart Fit for scope screens and a Smart Fit for 16:9 screens profile. You can turn on and use nonlinear stretch in its default configuration simply by turning on one of these profiles to match the screen type you have. In doing so, you'll use our recommended settings for all aspect ratios without the need to customize the look of nonlinear stretch. However, should you wish to customize it, this document is for you. Let's talk about what makes the nonlinear stretch special on the Envy. It has innovative features that allow you to use NLS not only horizontally, but also vertically. You can even apply horizontal and vertical NLS at the same time. Doing so shares the geometric stretch across both axes, creating a very natural looking and highly immersive image, perfectly fitting any content to any screen, regardless of the aspect ratio. Nonlinear Stretch Plus uses a special visual setup, which we'll cover in the back half of this lesson, with built-in test patterns for 14 different commonly known movie aspect ratios, which allows you to easily create custom NLS settings for each movie aspect ratio exactly how you want. The Envy then detects the aspect ratio changes instantly and applies your preferred nonlinear stretch settings automatically. By combining Envy's instant black bar detection, Envy can be configured to fill the screen regardless of the aspect ratio of the screen and content, and largely without you even noticing as the content you're watching changes aspect ratios, such as when going to and from the movie selection screen, or even multiple aspect ratio changes within the same movie. And for those who prefer to watch movies in their original aspect ratio, you can do that as well, saving nonlinear stretch for use for highly immersive sports and concerts. This shows a quick example of what we mean for doing nonlinear stretch with 16:9 content on a scope screen. So you can see the before and the after. So let's talk about configuring nonlinear stretch and how to access these settings. In the settings menu, there's a custom zoom menu page where you can turn on NLS for the current content. These options enable you to choose how much Envy zooms the image, and how much it stretches it, and how much, if any, nonlinear stretch it applies. This is a handy way to update the NLS settings for the current content playing without digging through the deeper custom zoom configuration options, which we'll cover next. So in the configuration menu, there is a custom zoom configuration page. You can think of this as the master settings for what all the nonlinear stretch inherits from. So in other words, when you're in the custom zoom configuration, you can pick and set all the custom zoom configurations you want for every aspect ratio. Then when you're in the settings menu, you can quickly make adjustments to whatever is being applied. When we get to the second half of this lesson, I'll demonstrate that for you. There's special test images for each of these 14 video aspect ratios, so you don't have to search for movies that have all these different aspect ratios in order to dial it in as you want. We provide a sample image that allows you to adjust this on the fly. So let's talk about nonlinear stretch settings and the settings that are available. The use of nonlinear stretch is very much a matter of personal taste. Although there's no right or wrong settings, there are techniques you can use to easily dial nonlinear stretching to your liking. So here we are inside the custom zoom configuration option. This is what this looks like. First, notice there's a title bar that shows the aspect ratio of the content which you're currently configuring the settings for. As we mentioned, you can configure this for up to 14 different aspect ratios, so that's selected in the top bar. For aspect ratios in between any defined aspect ratios, Envy will automatically interpolate the differences. Next is the active setting, which you can use to toggle between yes and no. Toggling back and forth is a great way to test your settings. You can also exit the menu and watch the content, return to the menu, and make final changes. Just remember to save your settings when you're all done. Next, there's the left and top crop and bottom and right crop. These control how much zoom to apply without adding any stretch. These controls are important because the more image you can zoom off the screen without it bothering you, the less distortion which will be required for the stretch to fill the screen. For example, usually for 16:9 content, you can use about 14 or 15 for these settings without cutting off any important information from the screen. As the aspect ratio gets larger, however, less cropping may be needed to prevent cropping off more important information. Often for sports or other viewing where there are tickers at the bottom of the screen, you can significantly increase the bottom right cropping to make the image much larger without cropping important or meaningful information off the screen. We demonstrated that in our earlier lesson on nonlinear stretch. Center stretch controls how much stretch is applied globally throughout the image. If you use 0, then Envy will not stretch anything inside the section defined by the horizontal and vertical areas. We'll be discussing that next. The center stretch can provide a nice compromise if you find the stretching toward the edges of the screen to be too strong or causing odd artifacts during vertical pans. We'll discuss this as we move further. The horizontal area defines the right and left sections of the screen that the horizontal stretch is applied to. On-screen guides show you what portion of the screen this covers as you adjust in real time. And similarly, the vertical area defines the top and bottom sections that the vertical stretch is applied to. The horizontal strength defines how much stretch is applied within the horizontal area. You will need to add horizontal stretch to close the gap between the edge of the content and the edge of the screen, or partway if you prefer to use less stretch and not fill the screen completely. The amount of horizontal stretch needed is a function of how much cropping you've used, the aspect ratio of the content, the aspect ratio of your screen, the size of the horizontal area, and the amount of vertical area and vertical strength. Don't worry, it's all very intuitive when you play with the controls. Vertical strength is the same as explained for horizontal strength, except, of course, for the vertical axis. Now, here's an important tip. Envy automatically limits the horizontal and vertical stretch to the maximum amount needed. If you exceed it in your settings, it's perfectly fine. For example, if you only need horizontal stretch of 25 to fill your screen horizontally, but enter a value of 100 for the strength, Envy automatically will limit the use of the strength to 25. In other words, Envy will not stretch the image beyond what is necessary to fill the screen, even if you add too much strength. Use this to your advantage. If you wish to fill the screen, we recommend using the strength of 100 for both horizontal and vertical, leaving the cropping areas adjustments as only ones that need your attention. The only time not to use 100 is if you want to minimize distortion and any artifacts by filling only part of the black bars. For instance, stretching 4.3 to a 2.0 content or stretching 16:9 to say 2.2. Now I'll go over some general guidelines for what we find provides optimal results with nonlinear stretch. As we've covered, nonlinear stretch can provide very enjoyable, very immersive experience, especially for those who are less sensitive to stretch and don't mind occasional artifacts that may be experienced. Note that there is no free lunch when it comes to stretching images with nonlinear stretch. You'll likely need to find it necessary to tolerate occasional artifacts in exchange for filling your screen. This is how I use my Envy all the time. If you're like most, you will find settings that offer a balance where there are usually no artifacts, and where they are, they're tolerable. Some people, however, may find that the artifacts are distracting, in which case there are options to apply less aggressive settings to fill some, but not all of the screen. Depending on your tolerance for nonlinear stretch and the type of content you're watching, you may find it desirable to watch with the original aspect ratio, or to watch only certain types of programs like sports with nonlinear stretch while watching other types of movies without it. The following general guidelines can help you quickly find the best nonlinear stretch settings to suit your taste. First, remember that cropping is your friend. As discussed elsewhere, the more cropping you use, the less stretch will be needed, and the less distortion from stretch and artifacts there will be from nonlinear stretch. Therefore, use left top and right bottom cropping to your advantage. Now, if you really want to preserve every pixel on the screen, even during nonlinear stretch, you can do that as well and just leave these settings at 0. Next, set the horizontal and vertical areas to 33 and set the vertical and horizontal strength to 100. We talked earlier about how 100 will not actually give you 100 strength, but rather just enough needed to fill the screen. Now it's time to evaluate your settings. If you find the images to your liking, watch some content this way and see if it has any undesirable artifacts, and then you can come back and tweak as necessary. It is recommended to keep the horizontal and vertical strength at 100 like we've talked about, and just adjust using the crop. If you find the image looks too stretched for your liking, try to increase cropping values as we talked about earlier. The more you crop, the less you stretch. Of course, you will reach a point where you can't crop any further without cutting important information off the image. If you still have a hard time finding the image ideally as you'd like, try increasing the horizontal and vertical area. Doing this will spread the stretch over a wider area. This brings the stretch more toward the middle of your image, adding stretch in the area your eyes are most focused on in exchange for a more gradual stretch through the remaining image. If you feel the image is still too stretched, try increasing the center stretch. Now, I know we have a lot of customers that like to use center stretch. Our default settings do not use this, but certainly it's great to experiment with. The center stretch adds a global stretch to the image, lessening the strength that's needed toward the image. This can greatly reduce panning artifacts and lessen distortion near the image, but in exchange for adding some stretch in the center of the image. Remember, no free lunch. If you still find that after all these changes, the artifacts or distortion are not to your liking, it's possible that your settings are too aggressive for your personal taste. For instance, if you're trying to fill a 4:3 image to a 240 screen, there's no doubt you're going to have strong artifacts as a result. Or if you're very sensitive to stretch, you may have to compromise by using less aggressive settings and not filling your screen. For instance, if you cannot find settings to stretch 16:9 to 240, try stretching it to around 2.2, roughly cutting your black bars in half. This can go a long way toward increasing the level of immersion by going wider than 16:9, while at the same time not being distracted by the artifacts. Note that if you want to make this compromise by not filling your entire screen, you'll need to reduce your strength from the 100 to something significantly lower, at which point you will see the black bars come back partially, and you can suit to taste from there. Next, this goes through an example like we did in the previous lesson on nonlinear stretch, where it's showing how to use the crop and stretch to dial in this game, in particular the ticker. You notice the ticker here, and essentially what we've done is we have cut off this bottom part that's highlighted in red, so you get a nice, more immersive image requiring less stretch overall, while you have the most important elements on the screen. And here's like a good example of before and after. Okay, let's go ahead and hop on over to the Envy and practice some of what we learned. Okay, now let's practice what we just learned in the prior part of this lesson. This is an image from the Spears and Munsell HCR benchmark disc, the Montage, excellent HCR reference material for demonstrating on your displays as well. Now, this is a 16:9 image that is being displayed on a scope screen. So the configuration you see here is a 237 screen. So if I go ahead and toggle the nonlinear stretch off, you'll see what it looks like without nonlinear stretch. Okay, now I'll go ahead and put it back on. Now, if you're wondering how to do that, we talked about this in earlier lessons. In the remote control configuration menu, you can assign one of your buttons to be able to toggle nonlinear stretch on and off. Very handy for when you're doing experimenting and want to compare the differences of different approaches that you might take when customizing nonlinear stretch. Now, let's go ahead and we're going to look at the settings menu. So if you go to the settings menu and you go into the custom zoom configuration, you can see these are the active settings that are being applied. Now, these are being derived from the master custom zoom configuration menu, which we also talked about. We're going to switch over and take a look at that in just a moment. But I just want to show you how this is being inherited from that menu setting. So for example, you can see here as I move through, these are the different options, and this is showing like my nonlinear stretch area for horizontal. So in this case, the left and the right side are the ones that are being stretched where the center part is not being touched. These are the strength settings we talked about. And this is the vertical area. So in this case, the top section and the bottom section are being controlled by nonlinear stretch where the middle is not. Okay, and likewise, I can come here and toggle this on and off like I was doing with the hotkeys on the remote control. Now, let's flip ahead to the configuration menu. So this is the custom zoom configuration. You can think of this as your master settings. So for each of these aspect ratios that you see, the MV will allow you to configure different nonlinear stretch configurations. For example, we talked about how you may not want to try to stretch 4:3 content to fill a 240 screen. That's going to be very strong and look kind of weird. So instead, you may only want to stretch it halfway. So let's just pick the 16:9 aspect ratio right now and take a look at this. Now, we talked earlier about how there are sample images for you to adjust. So you can see here the MV is displaying a sample image that's built in. This way you don't have to search for different aspect ratio content when you do your customization. So if you look here at the top bar, this allows us to scroll through those different aspect ratios that were on that menu. And I'll just flip through so you can see them. Okay, so in this case, let's say we wanted to work with this particular aspect ratio and we wanted to fine tune it. We can come through here and adjust the controls accordingly. So remember, we talked about these controls in the previous part of this lesson. You can quickly use this to compare how the stretch looks on and off for this aspect ratio. This is the left and top crop. So for example, let's take off the crop entirely. So as I did that, you can see the image move down and you get a little bit more of the sky. Let me put it back so you can see. Okay, and same thing for the bottom. Okay, so for those that do not want to lose a single pixel, you could keep these at 0. Now, center stretch, we talked about how some people like to apply this. I'll go ahead and add some of this so you can kind of see the effect as it increases. So then a good way to test it is to come back to here and go back and forth. I'm going to go ahead and turn that off. But you can see it's very interactive, so it allows you to adjust all these. Now, we talked about the nonlinear stretch area. As I decrease this, you can see that it's applying the stretch just to that extreme outer part, okay, as opposed to going this opposite direction. Now it applies a stretch over that wider part. So you have a lot of control here, and the same thing with the vertical. And we talked about the strength as well. So for example, 100 is not really 100. 100 is just finding the amount necessary to not use all the stretch. So for example, in this case, this is not stretching it to my full 237 aspect ratio, but somewhere in between, right? So I can turn this on and off and compare. So you can see it no longer fills the ends, right? So you might play with this and say, hey, this is kind of how I like it. I don't need to fill all of it, but this still looks really natural to me, and you may prefer it that way. And likewise, you could see when we get to about 21, that's filling the screen. Okay, so as you start to go more and more, nothing happens once you adjust both axes. So the result is the same with strength 100 on each as it is with 21 on each. That's the key point there. So another example, let's look at the 4x3 content. This is a good example where we're stretching it, where it still looks quite natural, but we're not trying to take this to fill the whole screen. And so this allows you to go through each aspect ratio and set it up exactly how you would like. And it's very flexible. And once you go ahead and set that and save it to base, when you go to the settings menus, like you see here, it's going to inherit that value. So the key difference is this menu here is great for setup, initial configuration, and testing. And then sometimes when you're watching content, you might find that you want to increase or decrease or change the nonlinear stretch. Maybe some of your ticker and sports is getting cut off. So instead of coming here and changing it, which you could do and digging through and finding the aspect ratio, you can jump straight to the settings menu, make your quick tweaks into that, and then go right back to your content. So this is really a more convenient way to adjust the current content you're watching versus this, which is designed for you to really dial things in. Now, let's take a look at an example where we use nonlinear stretch on a 16:9 screen to work with scope content, because this question comes up quite a bit. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change my screen configuration from 237 so that it is a 16:9 screen. Now, this is not something you would normally do on your own Envy going back and forth. It's just something that I need to do in order to demonstrate how this would work on a 16:9 screen. So I'll do that by going into the screen configuration menu. And as you would probably know from our previous lesson on setting screen boundaries, that's where this is set. So I'll go ahead and I will turn this back to a 16:9 screen like you see here. And then what I need to do is I will go into our profiles menu and I will choose Smart Fit for 16:9 screens. I should also mention that the presets that you saw in the custom zoom configuration were the result of choosing this profile, the Smart Fit for scope screens. So now I choose Smart Fit for 16:9 screens. Now, of course, you notice it didn't make any change when I did this because this is 16:9 content on a 16:9 screen. So let's take a look at how to get where we need to go to adjust the content. Okay, so now here we are on this is a 240 image, one of our sample images, and this is being displayed on your 16:9 screen. Now, you may not notice at first much of a difference, but as I turn the nonlinear stretch on and off, you'll see what we're doing here. Okay, so you can see that we're actually bringing back that about half of the top and bottom black bar to create a much more immersive experience. Now, we can go all the way, right? So we could go ahead and increase the strength here and go to the top. For example, if I remember, we talked about using 100, it will automatically just give us the max. Okay, and so now we're filling this 16:9 image, this scope image to fill a 16:9 screen, and it looks very natural. However, in movie content, we generally don't recommend trying to fill the entire black bar on a 16:9 screen. Generally, about half the screen is a point where people seem to really like it and not notice it. When you start going to like 3/4, people and things can start to look a little stretched. In case you're wondering, I'll go ahead and take the crop off also. Okay, so now this is a 16:9 image, a scope image that's fitting your 16:9 screen without dropping any pixels. Still looks very natural. If you saw this, my guess is that you would not readily think that this was actually being stretched. So that gives you an idea of the flexibility that's available with the Envy. Again, you can fit any aspect ratio content to any aspect ratio screen. And we did talk a lot about predefined aspect ratio screens, but if you happen to have a different screen aspect ratio, like a 2.0 or 2.2 or a 1.85, or even something completely custom, the Envy will also operate the same way because you will have defined your screen boundaries, so Envy will know what your aspect ratio is. We covered that in a previous lesson, so I'd recommend reviewing that lesson if you're unfamiliar with that aspect of the Envy. And then the nonlinear stretch can be used to manage your black bars on your custom screen aspect ratio all the same. Okay, so that covers our lesson on advanced nonlinear stretch configuration. Let's go ahead and move on to our next lesson.